It was supposed to be a simple evening, one that would celebrate months of long workdays and quiet victories. Marcus had been away from his hometown for years, building his life from the ground up. Now in his late 30s, he returned with success written quietly across his demeanor. Not through flashy jewelry or boastful displays, but in the calm confidence of a man who had overcome far too much to need validation. The air was warm, the streets humming with laughter and the soft buzz of a Friday night crowd. Downtown had changed since he left. New shops lined the sidewalks, restaurants glowed with polished glass and neon signage, and the once forgotten corners of his youth now pulsed with life. Among the new establishments, one name caught his eye: the Willow House. It looked elegant from the outside: gold-lettered signage, soft lighting, white tablecloths visible through large windows. Marcus smiled. It seemed like the perfect place to end his week, a quiet dinner before meeting a business associate in town. He parked his car and walked in, unaware that what awaited him inside would become the defining moment of his return. The hostess greeted a couple ahead of him with practiced warmth, guiding them to a table near the window. But when Marcus stepped forward, her smile faltered, almost imperceptibly, but enough for him to notice. Her eyes flickered down to his dark skin, then to his neatly pressed suit, as if assessing whether he truly belonged in a place like this. "Reservation?" she asked curtly, the politeness in her tone replaced by suspicion. Marcus replied calmly, giving his name and explaining he didn't have a reservation but hoped to be seated for one. She hesitated. Her eyes darted to the manager across the room, a middle-aged man with slicked back hair who glanced over, frowned, and shook his head slightly. The hostess swallowed hard before giving a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're fully booked this evening." Marcus looked around. Nearly half the tables were empty. A family had just walked in behind him, white, casually dressed, and they were seated immediately without question. His chest tightened, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. That same familiar burn. He asked quietly if there was perhaps space at the bar. The hostess shook her head. The manager came over then. His expression hardened into polite authority. He confirmed what she said: no tables, no bar seats, no service tonight. But there was something unspoken beneath his words. Something Marcus had heard his entire life in different forms. "You don't belong here." He stood there for a moment, the sounds of clinking glasses and laughter filling the silence between them. For a moment, he considered arguing, calling out what was so clearly happening. But then, he caught sight of a young black couple near the door, watching him carefully. Their eyes held recognition, that quiet exchange of shared pain. He didn't want to make a scene, not tonight. So he simply nodded, turned around, and walked out. The night air felt colder now. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, staring through the restaurant window where the same manager now smiled and poured wine for another guest. The injustice of it stung deeply, not because it was new, but because it was so familiar. He had worked his entire life to escape that look, that treatment, and yet here it was again, waiting for him like a ghost from his past. Marcus had come a long way from the small, town boy who once washed dishes in restaurants that wouldn't have seated him. Back then, he had dreamed of owning his own place. Not for the money, but for the dignity of it. A place where people were welcomed, no matter what they looked like. A place where kindness was the only currency that mattered. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the Willow House was part of a small restaurant chain, and Marcus was the new majority shareholder of the company that owned it. The acquisition had just been finalized that very morning. He hadn't even told anyone yet, not the local management, not the staff. He had planned to meet with the team next week, to introduce himself quietly and discuss future plans. But now, as he stood there under the glow of that sign, everything changed. The humiliation he felt began to transform, slowly, steadily, into something else: resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who had ever been made to feel small in a place they had every right to be. He got back into his car, pulled out his phone, and opened his email. His fingers moved steadily as he typed a short message to his assistant. "Schedule a meeting with the Willow House staff for Monday morning. No prior notice. I'll be attending in person." He hit send, then sat there for a moment, the glow of his dashboard lights reflecting in his eyes. He didn't feel angry anymore. He felt calm, the kind of calm that comes before a storm. When he started the car and drove off, the The city lights blurred past him, and a quiet smile tugged at the corner of his lips. They had refused to serve him. But soon they would realize who he truly was. And when that day came, the tables would turn, literally and figuratively. Monday morning arrived with a sense of quiet anticipation. The Willow House opened its doors as usual, sunlight filtering through the wide front windows, the faint hum of coffee machines in the background, and the crisp smell of fresh pastries from the kitchen. None of the staff knew that this would not be an ordinary day. The hostess, the same young woman who had turned Marcus away, stood behind the podium in her neat uniform. Her voice carried its usual rehearsed cheer as she prepared for the morning rush. The manager, Mr. Collins, reviewed the schedule at the bar counter, sipping coffee and lecturing a new employee about presentation and the kind of image they needed to maintain for upscale clientele. To him, the Willow House wasn't just a restaurant, it was his domain, a space that reflected his vision of exclusivity and class. He prided himself on keeping things refined, which in his mind often meant excluding anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of sophistication. When Marcus walked in that morning, dressed in a tailored gray suit, holding a slim leather folder under his arm, he didn't come as the humiliated customer from days ago. He came as the owner. His expression was calm, but behind it was the same quiet storm that had brewed since that Friday night. The hostess froze when she saw him. Recognition flashed across her face, followed quickly by panic. Before she could stammer out a word, the manager noticed the exchange and walked over. He didn't recognize Marcus at first. To him, this was just another well-dressed man, likely a business partner or supplier. With a shallow smile, he extended his hand and greeted him using the same smooth, controlled tone that had charmed investors and irritated employees for years. Marcus accepted the handshake, steady and composed, and asked if they could step into the office. Moments later, the staff watched as the two men disappeared behind the frosted glass door at the back of the dining area. Whispers began almost instantly. Inside the office, the air was tense. Mr. Collins leaned against the desk, arms crossed, trying to gauge the visitor's purpose. Marcus placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were the documents finalizing his ownership stake in the restaurant's parent company. The company letterhead bore his name and title in bold print: Marcus Green, Chief Executive Officer. The manager's confidence cracked. The color drained from his face as he scanned the papers again and again, hoping somehow he'd misunderstood. But there it was, undeniable, official, absolute. The man he had refused to serve just 3 nights ago now owned not only this restaurant but every branch under their brand. Marcus watched him in silence, giving him time to absorb the reality. Then, with measured calm, he spoke of policies, integrity, and the brand's commitment to equality and respect, values that had apparently been neglected at this particular location. He laid out, in crisp and emotionless detail, the expectations moving forward: zero tolerance for discrimination, full accountability, and retraining for every staff member. By the time Marcus left the office, the staff had gathered outside waiting nervously. Their manager trailed behind him, pale and shaken. The hostess stood rigid at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as Marcus walked past her. For a brief moment, he paused, meeting her eyes. She looked like she wanted to apologize but couldn't find the words. Marcus simply nodded and continued on. The employees exchanged uncertain glances as he left the building. They didn't yet know the full story, but they could feel the shift in the air. Something monumental had changed, and their world inside the Willow House would never be the same again. When Marcus returned to his car, he sat for a while, staring at the reflection of the restaurant in his rearview mirror. He wasn't satisfied yet, not out of vengeance, but because he understood that real change didn't come from one confrontation. It came from dismantling the attitudes that caused such moments in the first place. He decided he wouldn't fire anyone immediately. Instead, he would introduce a series of internal reviews, diversity training, and community partnerships designed to open the staff's eyes to the realities they'd ignored. But before that, he needed to see for himself just how deep the problem ran. So, over the following week, Marcus began visiting the other branches under different guises, sometimes dressed casually, other times arriving with colleagues of different races or backgrounds. What he found was eye-opening. Some locations embodied inclusivity and professionalism, while others mirrored the same toxic elitism as the Willow House. It wasn't one bad manager, it was a culture, one quietly shaped by people like Collins, who confused prejudice for standards. At night, Marcus thought about his younger self, the teenage boy who had worked in the kitchen of another restaurant just like this one. Back then, he'd been invisible to customers, ignored by management, but driven by dreams that seemed impossible. Those memories pushed him forward. This wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about creating space for the next kid who looked like him, spoke like him, or came from where he came from. On Friday, 1 week after that humiliating night, he returned to the Willow House. This time, not as a stranger or a silent observer, but as the man who would rebuild it. He entered through the same doors, but everything felt different. The staff, now aware of who he truly was, scrambled to greet him with rehearsed smiles and nervous energy. Mr. Collins, visibly sweating, rushed over, desperate to appear composed. The walls that had once felt so exclusive now seemed to close in on him. Marcus didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone commanded attention. The staff stood quietly as he addressed them, not as an executive scolding employees, but as a man holding up a mirror to their behavior. He reminded them that hospitality was not about serving the privileged, but about welcoming the human spirit. As he spoke, the guilt on their faces deepened. Some shifted uncomfortably, others lowered their gaze entirely. It was clear that for the first time, many of them saw the ugliness of what they'd normalized. When he finished, he told them there would be changes. In policy, in training, in leadership. And with that, he announced a temporary suspension for Mr. Collins pending review. The silence that followed was thick with shock. The hostess blinked back tears, whispering a quiet thank you under her breath as Marcus turned to leave. Outside, the air felt lighter, cleaner somehow. Marcus looked up at the sign again, its golden letters glinting in the sun. Soon, this place would truly reflect its name. The Willow House, a symbol of renewal, growth, and grace. But his work wasn't done. There were other branches, other stories, and other Colin-like figures hiding behind polished smiles and selective service. This was just the beginning. The next morning, the Willow House felt strangely subdued. The once confident manager's office sat empty, his desk cleared except for a stack of policy documents and a note from corporate awaiting his signature. The staff moved quietly, performing their tasks with an uneasy precision. It was as if the building itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Marcus had spent the night reviewing files, incident reports, and performance evaluations from all the restaurant's branches. What he found was a pattern that made his chest tighten, a network of prejudice subtly disguised under business decisions. Customer complaints from certain demographics were ignored, job applicants with foreign-sounding names were lost in the system, and employees from minority backgrounds were consistently passed over for promotions. It was systemic, carefully maintained by people who thought no one would ever look close enough to notice. And until now, no one had. Marcus arrived at the Willow House mid-morning unannounced once again. The staff stiffened when they saw him, unsure whether to smile or look away. Their nerves reflected the deep-rooted fear that comes from realizing one's comfort was built on injustice. He watched them work for a while, observing small moments, how the hostess subtly changed her tone depending on the customer's appearance, how certain patrons received warmer greetings than others. It was progress compared to before, but not enough. The problem wasn't just their behavior. It was the mindset that had shaped it. Later that afternoon, Marcus gathered the senior staff from all branches for a company-wide meeting at headquarters. The conference room buzzed with quiet tension as managers filed in, exchanging whispers and uneasy glances. They'd heard rumors about what happened at the Willow House, about the suspension, about their new CEO's surprise visits. Many expected a lecture. What they received was a reckoning. Marcus stood before them, not with anger, but with conviction. He presented data, testimonies, and real accounts from customers who had experienced discrimination in their restaurants. The evidence was undeniable. The room grew heavy as the weight of their silence pressed in. He spoke of accountability, of rebuilding trust, of what it truly meant to represent the brand's values. There was no rage in his voice, only the quiet, unshakable force of truth. When he finished, he told them something that silenced even the most skeptical. There would be no mass firings. Instead, there would be change, real, measurable change. Every manager, including those at the top, would undergo inclusion and empathy training. Every hiring process would be reviewed by a new ethics board. And every restaurant would host monthly community nights where anyone, regardless of class, background, or appearance, could dine freely and be treated as family. Some rolled their eyes behind polite masks, thinking it was corporate showmanship. Others sat in stunned reflection, realizing how far they had drifted from decency. Marcus saw both reactions and understood them. You couldn't change hearts overnight, but you could plant seeds. When the meeting ended, a few stayed behind to speak privately, quietly admitting they had witnessed or even participated in behavior they now regretted. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was a start. That evening, Marcus visited the Willow House again, this time sitting quietly in a corner booth. He watched as customers came and went. Some noticed him and whispered, but he didn't mind. His focus was on the staff. The hostess greeted every guest equally this time. The servers moved with more care, conscious of their tone and demeanor. Even the kitchen staff seemed to work with renewed energy. And yet, Marcus could feel the tension. The fear of losing jobs, of failing expectations, of not knowing how to fix what had been broken. He didn't want fear to be their motivation. He wanted understanding. When the restaurant closed for the night, Marcus walked the empty halls, running his hand along the polished wood panels. This place had once made him feel small, unwanted. Now it was his responsibility to make sure no one else ever felt that way again. But just as he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. It was an email, anonymous, with no sender name. The subject line read, "You don't know what's really happening." Inside was a message that chilled him. Some of them are pretending to change. But when you're not around, they're mocking you. The staff group chat is full of racist jokes. They think this is all just a phase. They don't take you seriously. They attached was a series of screenshots. Each one revealed messages from employees, including current managers, mocking Marcus's background, his suit, his speeches about equality. They laughed about how they'd faked the new policies, until he got bored and moved on. Marcus stared at the screen for a long time, feeling a familiar ache deep in his chest. The progress he thought he'd made suddenly felt fragile, almost illusionary. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was disappointed. The masks had only shifted, not disappeared. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat in his home office, the glow of his computer illuminating the quiet darkness. He knew what he had to do next. If they wanted to mock him behind closed doors, he would open those doors wide. The next morning, Marcus sent a company-wide announcement, a surprise audit of all communications, staff logs, and customer feedback systems. Every branch would be inspected, and any behavior contradicting the new code of conduct would be addressed immediately. The staff at the Willow House read the email with dread. Some panicked, deleting messages and clearing chats. But digital footprints rarely vanish completely. As the audit began, employees tried to act normal, greeting guests, smiling, serving, but their eyes betrayed the anxiety beneath. Rumors spread like wildfire. Everyone wondered who had sent the email, who had betrayed them, who would be exposed. Days later, when Marcus returned, he carried a stack of reports under his arm. Evidence of what the audit had uncovered. Behind every professional smile lay a story of two-faced loyalty, of people who only respected power when it served them. But there were also moments of hope. Staff who had defended him, who had spoken up, who had refused to participate in the mockery. It wasn't all darkness. There were lights, small but real. Marcus knew the next step would define everything. Not just his leadership, but his legacy. Would he punish those who wronged him? Or would he show them something far more powerful than revenge? He looked up at the sign above the door once more, the Willow House, and remembered why he started this journey. The willow bends but does not break, it endures. And as the rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass, Marcus made his decision. The morning after the audit began, the Willow House was no longer the prestigious fine dining restaurant it had once prided itself to be. The whispers of superiority, the smug glances, and the performative politeness had all vanished, replaced by the kind of quiet that only comes before a storm. Every employee, from the host to the head chef, moved with anxious caution. The tension clung to the air like humidity before thunder. Marcus arrived without fanfare. There was no need for an entourage or announcement. His presence alone carried the weight of authority now. He moved through the restaurant like a man who had already seen behind the curtain, who knew every secret the walls tried to hide. The audit results were damning. Screenshots, audio recordings, and reports from multiple locations painted a picture far worse than he'd expected. Prejudice hadn't just survived the new policies, it had adapted, hiding behind sarcasm, private group chats, and subtle acts of exclusion. But even among the rot, Marcus found something else, proof that not everyone was complicit. A handful of employees had consistently defended him in private, correcting others when jokes went too far, refusing to join in when the mockery began. Their courage, though quiet, gave him hope. That morning, Marcus gathered every employee of the Willow House in the dining area before opening hours. The tables were cleared, the lights dim, the silence thick. No one dared to look him directly in the eye. He stood before them, calm, collected, but undeniably firm. He began by recounting what he'd learned, not just about the messages, but about the deeper culture that had infected the restaurant. He spoke of how prejudice had become normalized, how laughter had been used as a shield for cruelty, and how arrogance had disguised itself as professionalism. No one interrupted, no one moved. The guilt was palpable. He didn't name names, not yet. Instead, he spoke about responsibility, about the difference between fear-driven compliance and genuine respect, about what it means to truly serve people, not just for money, but for dignity. When he finally revealed the evidence, gasps rippled through the crowd. The screenshots appeared on a projection screen, unfiltered, unaided, undeniable. There were the jokes, the slurs disguised as humor, the sneering references to his background. Some faces turned pale, others red with shame. And then came the moment no one expected. Marcus didn't fire anyone. Not immediately. Instead, he gave them a choice, a public, irreversible choice. Those who had participated in the mockery could step forward, admit what they had done, and commit to a mandatory re-education and community service program. Those who denied or hid would be investigated further and permanently banned from any future employment within the company's network. For several long seconds, no one moved. The air was suffocating. Then slowly one employee stepped forward, the hostess, trembling. Then another, the sus chef. And then a third. Soon, nearly half the staff stood before him, eyes lowered, admitting their guilt in silence. Marcus nodded. He wasn't here to humiliate them. He was here to break the cycle. Each of them would have to face the consequences, not through firing, but through learning. They would spend the next months attending empathy training, volunteering at community centers, and serving people they had once mocked. When the meeting ended, the restaurant was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't fear that filled the room. It was reflection. That afternoon, Marcus met privately with a few of the staff who had defended him, including a young waiter named Jacob. The waiter had risked his job by reporting the racist messages in the first place. It turned out he was the one who had sent the anonymous email. Jacob confessed that he couldn't stand the hypocrisy anymore. He admired Marcus for his calm strength and fairness, but he feared nothing would change if someone didn't expose the truth. Marcus listened carefully, grateful but heavy-hearted. The young man's bravery reminded him of his own past, of the years he had stayed silent, hoping things would improve on their own. As the weeks passed, Marcus oversaw the transformation of the Willow House. The old staff handbook was replaced with new policies centered on equity and respect. The DA Corps, once designed to appeal to an exclusive crowd, was subtly redesigned to feel welcoming to all. Even the menu evolved, featuring dishes inspired by diverse cultural backgrounds, each one telling a story of inclusion. At first, customers were confused. Some even complained about the changes. But word began to spread. The Willow House wasn't just another luxury restaurant anymore. It was a symbol, a place that had confronted its own demons and chosen to change. Corporate media caught wind of the story. News outlets began reporting on the restaurant that reformed itself, praising Marcus's unconventional leadership. Invitations for interviews poured in, yet Marcus declined most of them. He wasn't interested in fame. He wanted results. Still, beneath the progress, a storm brewed quietly. Not everyone accepted the change. A small group of ex-employees who had been terminated after the audit began posting online, accusing Marcus of reverse discrimination. They painted him as a tyrant who punished them for having opinions. The posts gained traction, spreading fast on social media. Soon, online trolls joined in, mocking Marcus, sending hate messages, calling for boycotts of the restaurant. Anonymous calls flooded the business line, some filled with threats. The progress he had worked so hard to build was suddenly at risk of unraveling. But Marcus refused to be intimidated. He had faced worse before. Years of quiet exclusion, humiliation, and dismissal. This was just another form of resistance to change. Still, the pressure mounted. investors grew nervous. Corporate advisors urged him to issue a formal apology, to ease public tensions. Marcus knew what that meant: to dilute the message, to make the truth more comfortable for those who didn't want to face it. He stood at a crossroads. If he apologized, he could protect the restaurant's image. But if he stayed silent, the smear campaign might destroy everything he'd built. That night, Marcus sat alone in the empty dining hall. The lights were dim, the air still. He stared at the framed photographs of past owners that lined the wall, all white men in suits smiling confidently. His own portrait, newly added, hung at the end of the row. It was a reminder of how far he had come and how much farther he still had to go. He realized then that this fight was bigger than the Willow House. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small because of who they were. And as dawn crept through the windows, painting the tables in soft light, Marcus made his decision. The next day, he would go public, not with an apology, but with the truth. The following morning, the Willow House awoke to a media frenzy. News vans lined the street outside, microphones pointed at the front doors, flashes bursting every few seconds. The once quiet block now hummed with the energy of controversy. Marcus had decided to face the chaos head-on. He arrived early, calm and composed, dressed in a tailored suit that carried no trace of fear. His team had urged him to postpone the press conference, to let things cool down. But he knew waiting would only give his critics more room to twist the truth. When he stepped to the podium, the reporters immediately began shouting questions. Some asked about the audit. Others demanded to know whether he discriminated against the white staff who had been fired. But Marcus didn't flinch. He began with the truth, not a rehearsed statement or polished spin, but the raw story of what had happened. He told them about the night he was refused service at the very restaurant he now owned. He spoke about the humiliation, the condescension, the look on the manager's face when he realized Marcus was just another customer and not someone who mattered. The cameras clicked relentlessly as he went on. He described how he had chosen not to retaliate that night, how he had quietly bought shares in the restaurant chain, and how he'd risen through sheer perseverance until he became the majority owner. Then he spoke about what he found: the deep, systemic prejudice that had festered beneath the restaurant's polished image. The slurs, the exclusion, the laughter that came at the expense of dignity. And finally, how he decided not to destroy the people responsible, but to educate them, to offer them a chance at redemption rather than vengeance. His words weren't rehearsed, but they carried a kind of calm authority that silenced even the harshest reporters. When he finished, there was a moment of stillness, as if everyone, for a brief second, understood the magnitude of what he'd said. But the calm didn't last. Within hours, the internet erupted. Supporters flooded social media, praising his strength and leadership. Hashtags like "I Stand With Marcus" and "The Willow Truth" trended worldwide. Celebrities shared his speech, calling him a symbol of modern justice and courage. But the backlash came just as swiftly. Opponents accused him of playing the race card. Anonymous accounts flooded comment sections with slurs and hate speech. Former employees gave interviews, twisting facts, claiming they had been victims of reverse racism. Corporate sponsors began to waver. A few investors threatened to withdraw their support unless Marcus issued an apology and distanced himself from what they called political messaging. Behind the scenes, the pressure was suffocating. Some of the restaurant's branches faced vandalism. Graffiti on the walls, broken windows, threatening notes slipped under the door. Staff members received harassing calls at night, but Marcus refused to retreat. He gathered his remaining team, those who believed in what they were doing, and told them that change never comes without resistance. He reminded them why they started, not to gain praise, but to create a world where no one would be judged by their appearance. He launched a campaign, not a corporate one, but a human one. Through social media and community events, he opened the Willow House to people of all backgrounds. He hosted unity dinners, where people from different races, faiths, and classes sat together, sharing meals and stories. Each event was live-streamed, not for publicity, but for transparency. The results were extraordinary. Videos of strangers hugging, crying, and laughing together inside the restaurant began to circulate online. What had started as a storm of hate began to shift into something else, a movement. Still, not everyone celebrated. Among the shadows, a few of his old adversaries plotted quietly. One of them was Greg Turner, the former general manager who had mocked Marcus years ago when he was just a customer. Greg had been fired after the audit, but instead of moving on, he grew obsessed with revenge. He began contacting reporters, leaking old internal documents, and spinning false narratives about Marcus's management. He claimed Marcus used fear and guilt to control his employees, portraying him as a manipulative opportunist. The smear campaign gained traction. One evening, a major news outlet ran a story titled, "The Real Marcus Hill Hero or Hypocrite." It was filled with half-truths and twisted quotes. The comment section exploded with division, half defending Marcus, half calling him a fraud. It seemed the world had split in two, those who believed in his message, and those who wanted to see him fall. Marcus tried to stay strong, but even he wasn't immune to the weight of it all. The hate messages, the threats, the endless interviews, it wore on him. He began sleeping less, eating little, and spending most nights alone in the office. One evening, as he reviewed the financial reports, he realized how much damage the controversy had done. Profits had dropped, sponsorships had pulled out, and corporate partnerships were at risk. The Willow House was in danger, not from racism this time, but from the chaos of trying to fight it. He sat in silence for a long time, staring at the restaurant's logo embossed on the cover of a menu. The willow, a tree that bends but doesn't break. It was a reminder of resilience, of grace under pressure. That night, he made a decision. He wouldn't just fight to save his business. He would fight to save the message behind it. He reached out to several nonprofit organizations that promoted diversity and inclusion. Together, they began planning a nationwide campaign, one that would go beyond his restaurant and into schools, companies, and communities. But as plans took shape, Greg Turner made his final move. Late one night, he hacked into the restaurant's private files and released confidential employee data online. Payrolls, personal information, even internal memos. It was a malicious act meant to destroy Marcus's credibility once and for all. Within hours, chaos erupted. Employees panicked. The media pounced. Legal teams scrambled. Marcus's dream, everything he had worked for, teetered on the edge of collapse. And yet, deep inside, Marcus felt something shift. The fear that had haunted him for weeks began to fade. He had faced every kind of injustice life could throw at him, and still, he had risen. This time would be no different. As dawn broke, he prepared to face the world once more, not as a victim, but as a fighter. The truth was still on his side, and the world was about to see it. The morning after Greg's sabotage, the city woke to chaos. News channels blared headlines about the data leak scandal at the Willow House, while online commentators rushed to dissect every rumor. Some called for investigations, others mocked Marcus, saying his so-called moral empire had finally fallen. Marcus arrived at the restaurant early, long before anyone else. The place that had once been alive with the soft hum of conversation and the comforting aroma of fresh bread now felt hollow. Tables sat untouched, chairs misaligned from the frantic night before. The once proud logo on the window now seemed fragile, a symbol tested by the world's cruelty. He stood there for a long while, letting the silence speak. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything. The betrayals, the hate, the relentless scrutiny. He had been humiliated, targeted, and lied about. Yet beneath all that pain burned something indestructible, resolve. He picked up his phone and called his legal team. There would be no more silence. This time, Marcus was going to fight back with the one thing Greg and his followers couldn't twist: the truth. The following days were a blur of meetings, investigations, and tense discussions. Cybersecurity experts traced the data breach back to an anonymous IP, but Marcus already knew who was behind it. Greg Turner had left digital fingerprints everywhere, a trail of arrogance that revealed his hand in the attack. Marcus's legal team worked tirelessly to compile the evidence, preparing to expose him publicly. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with revenge alone. He wanted meaning. He wanted the world to see that justice wasn't about destruction. It was about restoration. So while the lawyers built their case, Marcus quietly began rebuilding his community. He reached out to every employee whose information had been leaked, personally apologizing and ensuring their safety. He paid for identity protection services, replaced lost wages, and even opened a hotline for emotional support. Word spread quickly. The same media that had once crucified him now began to take notice. Reporters who had painted him as reckless started to question the narrative. Public sentiment began to shift again, slowly but unmistakably. Still, The real turning point came a week later, during a televised press conference called by the local business bureau. The room was packed with journalists, cameras, and curious onlookers. Marcus stepped up to the podium, wearing a dark suit and the quiet confidence of a man who had weathered the storm. He didn't start with accusations or anger. Instead, he began by acknowledging the pain of those affected by the data breach. His employees, his customers, and his community. He admitted responsibility as the owner and promised accountability. Then, with deliberate calm, he revealed the truth. He played the evidence on the large screen behind him. Digital logs, timestamps, and messages that connected Greg Turner directly to the data theft. The room fell silent as the facts unfolded. Every lie Greg had told unraveled in real time. When the presentation ended, Marcus took a deep breath and said the words that would echo across news outlets for days. This isn't just about a restaurant. It's about what happens when hate, resentment, and prejudice go unchallenged. We can't fix the past by destroying each other, but we can choose integrity even when the world expects us to seek revenge. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, law enforcement arrested Greg Turner for cybercrimes, corporate sabotage, and data theft. The man who had once laughed at Marcus, who had mocked him as a customer and sabotaged him as an owner, now faced public disgrace. His career was over, his reputation in ruins. But Marcus didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in another man's downfall, only a quiet sense of balance restored. In the weeks that followed, the Willow House transformed. What had begun as a local restaurant became a symbol of resilience. Donations poured in from around the world to support Marcus's new initiative. The Willow Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to empowering minority entrepreneurs and advocating workplace equality. He began hosting leadership workshops, teaching young people how to turn pain into purpose, prejudice into power. His story became a case study in universities, a viral inspiration on social media, and a rallying cry for justice done right. Even the restaurant staff, once divided by fear and bias, found new unity. The kitchen became a place of laughter and collaboration again. Every meal served carried a message that everyone, regardless of skin color, background, or faith, deserves dignity. Months later, on the anniversary of his ownership, Marcus held a private dinner at the Willow House. He invited employees, community members, and even former critics. The event wasn't for publicity, it was for closure. As he stood at the front of the dining room, gazing at the faces around him, he realized something profound. The journey had never been about proving himself to the world. It had been about healing. Healing from the sting of humiliation, from the scars of racism, from the endless cycle of hate that too many people accepted as normal. That night, after everyone had left, Marcus walked outside and looked up at the sign glowing softly in the evening air. The willow, bending but never breaking, graceful even under pressure. He smiled to himself. The man who had once been refused a seat at a table now owned not just the restaurant, but the story. He had rewritten what it meant to overcome prejudice, not through vengeance, but through grace, integrity, and strength. The media would later call it the redemption of the Willow House. But to Marcus, it was something simpler. The truth finally standing taller than hate.